Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 20th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. I'm so pleased that you could join us here today. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I have a few important bits of information to share. This year's series, in its 20th iteration, is dedicated to Peter Goodwin. Peter was a longtime History Room manager, Bath Historical Society trustee, and the founder of the Town History series. This series began in 2005, and since then, Peter works tirelessly to build momentum year after year to bring us where we are today. Our community looks forward to these talks every year, and it's because of Peter's dedication and that of his successors that we're here today. I also want to thank all of the historical societies and member towns for selecting our fabulous speakers and helping to get the word out. Thank you also to the Bath Historical Society for generously offering to professionally film this series. If you're with us in person today, please note that the speaker is being filmed by a camera at the back of the room, so please be mindful when you're passing by. This recording will be available in our collection on DVD and will be available for checkout, and the Zoom recording of today's program will be available on our YouTube page next week. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and the Q&A feature. If you would like to enable closed captioning, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn them on. And please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at any time during the talk, and I'll make sure that our presenter gets your questions. Our speaker today represents the Georgetown Historical Society. Theo Houtvik is a Georgetown resident, but is originally from the Netherlands. He's a retired public official and worked in town planning for the towns of Falmouth, Brunswick, and Sanford. He is also a landscape architect and has been interested in the history of public parks. In 1999, Theo co-authored a book with the Maine State historian Earl Shuttleworth Jr. titled Bold Vision, The Development of the Parks of Portland, Maine, which is available downstairs for checkout. Most recently, Theo has been researching the history of Reid State Park, and we're so happy to have him here today to present his work. Welcome, Theo.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Can you get rid of that little bar at the top?
Yep, just hit the little X.
Yeah, because,
Right there, you see the little tiny X.
well, see, my cursor doesn't work in.
Okay, let's escape. And then we'll go back into screen share.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mary Kate, for the lovely introduction. Just one correction, that Earl and I edited the Bold Vision book, but one of the authors is sitting right here, Noni Ames. We had no less than 10 authors. Each author took a park in Portland and wrote about it. So if you're interested in parks in Portland, then that's worth checking out. So as Mary Kate will solve the technical issue here, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to represent Georgetown here today, and I'm also very pleased to be here part of the 20th anniversary series. That's quite an accomplishment.
Can you get out of full screen? Because I think your mouse isn't working.
Well, I think we need to do stop screen share. Hold on. Ooh.
Okay,
Yeah,
there
that
we
was
go. Now
pretty
is your
good.
mouse working? You just hit X.
Now I need my glasses.
I got it, Taylor. That's okay.
This doesn't come out of my time, I hope.
Okay, you're all set. You can go back into, you're in screen share, so don't worry about that. You can just go into presentation.
Okay. Come on, get rid of this thing. There. All right.
And then the ellipsis and hide floating controls again.
Oh, man. See, you need to do this in a different order.
There you go.
Okay, it's gone.
Yep. Perfect.
All right. So here we are. Let's fasten your seatbelts. I have lots of slides, but I wanted to start off with this slide that you may have seen in the Portland Press Herald, because this is Reid State Park after one of the January storms. And the park is currently closed because the damage was so extensive. If you know the park, then you'll see there is a boardwalk on the left side of the slide, and Haley Parsons, the park manager, is standing there. And along the boardwalk are benches, and you can see the benches are completely gone, and it's a set of stairs where the big gap is, stairs are gone. So it's a huge damage. And the state is working very hard on this park and various other sites to make them available. I just wanted to recognize the incredible effort that the state has done, and of course the power of storms. Anyway, Reid State Park, in my opinion, it's multiple stories. Of course, it's about recreation and conservation. And as we can see from the storm, it's about geology, oceanography, and ecology. But it's also a story of state park development, as well as residential development. And I think it's a story of the American dream, a story of philanthropy, and ultimately, I think it's a story of the importance of family and of home. And we'll touch upon some of that in rapid fashion to give you an idea of that. Also, Reid State Park is a story of Georgetown. As you can see from this road sign on the Saginaw Bridge, Georgetown and Reid State Park are kind of tied to the hip. And a lot of the identity of Georgetown, I think, is tied up with tourism and people coming to the beach and enjoying Maine as a great place to be. First, a whole host of thank yous, because this kind of a project you cannot do alone. And many groups and people have helped me. I want to call out Todd and Karen Barabee. Todd is Walter Reid's great-great-grandson. And he's still around, runs with his wife the morning bed and breakfast in Georgetown, and they let me use some of Walter Reid's personal papers. Also, I want to call out Susie Wren, who's going to keep me on time. She's my wife, and she has encouraged me with this project that has been kind of going on for a few years. Some initial comments. This is a story that I'm telling mostly through newspaper articles, through property deeds at the Registry of Deeds. The newspaper articles you can get through the Patent Free Library online site, as well as documents that the Bureau of Parks and Recreation has in Augusta. I'm going to tell the story more or less chronologically. I want to emphasize it's a preliminary story. If you have corrections or elaborations, I'm most welcome to hear those. And that I hope that in the future, other aspects of Reid State Park can be explored further, such as the fascinating geology that created the beach part of the park in the first place. Why do a project like this? I believe that knowing more about Reid State Park enhances our experience there, and that in turn allows us to better take care of a place like Reid for future generations. And of course, that applies to many other places. The more we know about a place, the more we can care for it and know what it's all about. Reid State Park, and you already heard his name, Walter Reid. I believe it's a triumph that the park actually happened. It could have gone very differently. Many people were involved in making it happen, but Walter Reid was really the key person. Walter Reid was born in Georgetown. He never forgot where he came from. And remarkably, he came full circle in his life, and we'll hear about that. So who is this Walter Reid? In 1946, there was a newspaper article, a big 2-page spread, as you can see here. Walter Reid, donor of land to Maine, has lived fabulous life. And the writer of the article starts the article by saying, who is this Walter E. Reid, about whom the public apparently knows so little? What sort of man is he? Where has he been? What has he done? And how is it that a man able to give so much land to the state hasn't been known before that? So people were really wondering about him. But first, let's take a look at the land. Here is a 1579 map by Jonas Jones of Georgetown. And in the red oval, we see the land that we now know as Reid State Park. It also has a figure which was representative of a surveyor with the surveyor's instrument. And the land shows, besides an approximate size of it, it shows as vacant land and pond. But was it really vacant? We know from a letter that Billy Todd wrote that there was a house on the property, on the area that we now know as Todd's Point, built by Samuel Todd, that his son, who was born there in that house, he ultimately sold the property to another man, Benjamin Riggs, who then moved the house to Egypt, which we also know as Gwynland, somewhere along the Gwynland Road. I don't know if the house still exists. I have no idea where it is, but I do know that the land was subsequently sold to various other parties, and I won't bore you with that, but it was sold multiple times. But ultimately, the town of Georgetown ending up owning a portion of that property. And the property was really not known as Todd's Point, it was known as the Great Pond Lot. And it was because the prior owners had not paid their taxes. So the town ended up with owning the property. And that's, I think, a key aspect in the development of our story. So the Great Pond Lot, if you look at a series of old maps, and I have here a few of them, the Great Pond shows up by name, and it shows in more greater or lesser detail the sort of shape of this pond aspect that had an outlet to the sea. But the map of Saginaw County of 1858 also shows houses and buildings. And we're going to take a closer look at the upper right piece, which is known in Georgetown as Harmon's Harbor. And on this map, it's called Herman's Harbor, but we now know it as Harmon's Harbor. Here we have it in a somewhat enlarged format. And it shows buildings that existed at the time, along with the names of the owners at that time. And we see here a J. Reid, we see here a J. Harford, and a few doors down, another J. Harford. If you wonder why we're sort of focused on that, it's because of this. And here is a genealogy chart. And we see here a Joseph Harford, and we see a John Reid. Joseph and his wife had many children. And here is John Reid, a painting that hangs in the Mooring Bed and Breakfast. Joseph had many children, one of whom was Lydia. And Lydia, as you can see from the chart, married John, had a whole host of children. Here's Lydia. And one of them that was Walter Reid, the sixth one in the lineup. Susie helped me to the 1870 census. And so we have the chart on the right with our key figures. And lo and behold, there is John, there's Lydia, and here is Walter. And Walter is 1 year old. He's a male, he's white, and he's at home. So we have him pegged in 1870. He has arrived. So we know he was born in Harmon's Harbor, 1869. He then attended the Wood School for 3 years. The Wood School, as portrayed here, is the stone school building that you see on your way to Reid State Park on the left side of the road. You go to the turn and the school is right there. The Friends of Reid State Park and Reid State Park staff cleared vegetation, so now you can actually see the building. And he walked from Harmon's Harbor, you know, a mile, something like that, every day to school for 3 years. But in 1877, his father, who was a sea captain, died, and he was sent to Brunswick to become a chore boy in return for room and board, work on a farm and work with another person between the ages of 8 and 11. When he was 11, the story goes that he had his first sailing trip from Dresden, Maine to New York, a ship carrying ice. And that subsequently he had a whole host of jobs, and I won't sort of go into that, it would be too long a talk, but various sales jobs, and he sailed many different trips, but ultimately sales was where he excelled. Initially it was yeast, then later beef, but ultimately tobacco. He was sort of the #1 salesman for tobacco in New England. As a young man, he was 24, he marries a girl from Waterville, Clara Hallway. And here we have Clara, also a painting that is in the morning bed and breakfast. Back to the land. So the town of Georgetown owns a portion of the Great Pond lot. But what does the town do? The town sells the property and sells it to a man by the name of Dr. John Stedman for $400. And here we have the deed. Here we have John Stedman and his wife. John Stedman was a doctor who lived in Georgetown, lived on the Indian Point Road, and he got the property. So the town, wanted it back on the tax rolls. They didn't have a vision of, hey, a town beach. We could do something with that. So another key event in the history of the park. What did John Stedman do? He hired a surveyor the moment he acquired the property, a man by the name of Alexander Johnston. He was a surveyor from Wiscasset, and sort of in my view, I don't know much about him. He was sort of a Renaissance type man. He also designed buildings, and his surveyor compass is actually at Harvard University. And we found in Walter Reed's personal files this handwritten letter from the surveyor to John Stedman. And the letter says, now I'll get my glasses. The term Great Pond Lot is no description of it, nor does it locate it at all, which must be done, or it is no conveyance at all. So the property had transferred from person to person as, the Great Pond Lot. Oh. And the surveyor said, no, you can't really do that. You need to be more precise about that. And he goes on to explain that the name is notorious. Everybody knows where it is, and that it's a large tract, and it describes it well enough for taxing purposes, et cetera, but he says what you really need is an explicit metes and bounds in order to know what you're buying. So he does describe a metes and bounds. We have that here on a plan that's in the Registry of Deeds, and there's a map, and it's what I think the first detailed map of Reid State Park. And what we also have is his bill for all his work. Original bill, it's very detailed. It's lovely to see the cost of survey. It was $84.92. So it was not too bad. The plan, this particular plan, was not drawn by Alexander Johnston, but by a man named Albert West from Boston. And we're going to learn a little bit more about Albert West. But first, I want to show you a sort of a blow-up of this plan, because you see the Great Pond Marsh, you see Todd's Point at the bottom right, you see Griffith's Head in the middle at the top, and you see the little river, all features that we know exist there. But here is something I want you to see. It's the next picture is an aerial photograph on Google that shows this property. And it shows you how remarkably accurate this plan is. See that? And now I'm going to click one more. So focus on one part of the map. There it is. Amazing. 1883. On this map, there's also this notation. It talks about that this plan is part and parcel of an agreement. It's an agreement between John Stedman, Charles Clark from Vermont, and this man, Albert West of Boston. And it's an agreement that actually was several years later. What did these men come up with? They came up with a subdivision plan. They knew the property was special. And they had CEC Breck, civil engineers from Boston, lay out this subdivision plan right on Todd's Point. And, well, it didn't happen. But look at this. We're going to take a closer look. First, I want to orient you. So Griffiths Head Beach it starts at the bottom, if you know Todd's Point with the parking lot and the bathhouse. And Half Mile Beach is shown sort of at the top. So you're right at these rocks and at where the bathhouse is now. And there's a road, that Griffiths Head Road, that was identified right at the high water line. But here I'll go back. Take a look at, for instance, the lots at the top of the plan, and then look at this tree line. It's a remarkably, accurate way of fitting as many lots as they could on Todd's Point. A closer look at this map shows us that there were no fewer than 169 lots, and that they were small, mostly about 40 by 80 feet, or 0.07 acres. And you can wonder, what can you build on a lot like that? But here's the other remarkable thing that I want you to know. 35 of these lots were actually sold. Some people bought one lot, some people bought two lots, some people bought 4 or 5 lots. I think with the idea of, this is going to increase in value, this is a good investment. And most of that happened in 1893. So this could have become, a big development. Another key aspect in Reid State Park. Well, what did these owners find out? Well, here is a geological survey map of 1894. So right around the same time, I've highlighted the Reid State Park property for you, only to tell you that this was a property you couldn't get to. It shows some roads, as you can see from this map, but these roads weren't really roads. They were maybe more paths that the people realized that their dream to develop something on this property was hard to come by because you couldn't get there. And something else happened. We have here a death certificate of John Stedman. John Stedman died in 1899, and we know that he died because he was on a yacht, and the yacht overturned in Sheepscot Bay, and his body was never recovered. So the main mover and shaker, in my view, of this project disappeared from the scene. And so nothing really much more happened with it. So let's go back to Walter Reid. We're at around 1900. He has been living in Waterville, but he starts to summer in Georgetown. And 1 year later, he purchases his first parcel of land in Georgetown. But 1 year after that, he starts a company by the name of the Seguinland Cottage Company. He has business associates from Waterville and also from Augusta. He's in his early 30s. And this is a huge event in the history of Reid State Park. What did the company do? Well, the company buys the Great Pond lot from William Lewis, who was a trustee for the estate of John Stedman and his partners. So he takes it over. And what else did they do? This was 1902. Huge event, I think, again, in the history of the park. They've bought other property, plan showing land of the Seguinland Cottage Company in 1902. Well, they actually hired an engineer to create a subdivision plan. Multiple lots, not at Todd's Point, but really along what we now know as Seguinland Road. So the sort of land between Harmon's Harbor and Reid State Park. They had the company had visions of doing multiple subdivisions of this property, but Seguinland Road didn't really exist either. So there was work that needed to be done, and people needed to discover this area. So what else did the company do? 2 years later, Walter Reid buys the home that we now know as the Mooring Bed and Breakfast, and he resigns from the American Tobacco Company. He sort of I think wanted to spend time on the efforts of the Seguinland Cottage Company. and be done with tobacco sales. The cottage company builds a hotel along Seguinland Road called the Seguinland, and we now know it as the Grey Havens. It still exists. Here's the dining room in its almost original state, so you can partake in history. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And the idea of the hotel was this, and I found an advertisement in the Boston Globe that talked about Seguinland, the new resort. And it says, if you are looking for a summer home, see this place. 1,500 acres to select from, nearly 5 miles of frontage. So they had amassed a lot of land in that area and were seeking people to come to the hotel, explore the area, and realize that a better place to take your family cannot be found on the Atlantic coast. So this is when the hotel opened its doors in 1904. Promotional brochures exist. There's one that's lovely with a large fold-out photograph of the area, and one of the brochures talks about creating a delightful, up-to-date summer resort. So that was the vision of the Seguinland Cottage Company, and now we're around 1905. But what happened? 2 years later, the Waterville Trust Company forecloses on the Seguinland Cottage Company. Here we have the notice of foreclosure. It talks about that 15 promissory notes had been taken out, $500 each. They needed to be repaid 1 year after the date, and that did not happen. So the trust company started foreclosure proceedings. But Walter Reid steps in 1 year after that. He averts the foreclosure because the Seguinland Cottage Company sells all of its holdings to Walter Reid, and here we know for how much, $2,889. And Walter Reid turns around and forms the Seguinland Realty Company, a new company. And this is a company not with business associates from Waterville and Augusta, but with his 3 children. And so those 2 events make him really solely in control of what could happen with this land. Around that time, he gets a 2-page spread in the Bath Independent, well-named Old Honesty. When I first saw that, I thought, what is that? But it really refers to the Old Honesty tobacco that the John Fincher Brothers Company put out. It also talks about a story of a Georgetown boy who has worked his own way, unaided, to the position of the most envied salesman of the world's greatest tobacco company, which was the American Tobacco Company. This spread has a picture of him. I'm sorry that it's kind of dark. It also shows the Seguinland Hotel. It shows his home in Waterville, and it shows the schoolhouse that he walked to as a young boy, and it tells, of course, his life story up to that point. The article ends by saying, well, he's the kind of man that the town and county should take great pride, and he's destined for greater things if his health is spared. So that's sort of, they leave us hanging with there. So Walter Reid, in 1910, he again switches gears. He becomes involved with Charles Morse and his steamship ventures, ultimately gets ownership interest in various steamship companies, and one of which owned the steamers Harvard and Yale. The steamers Harvard and Yale were exceptional in their time. They were steam turbine operated passenger vessels. They were the fastest passenger ships around at that time, and they sailed between Boston and New York. But in World War I, the US Navy commandeered and later purchased both ships for troop transport. And one of the ships made about 30 trips from the United States to Europe, The other ship made about 60 crossings between across the English Channel from England to Europe. Two other things happen in this time period. His wife dies unexpectedly of a stroke. She was 52, and Walter Reid, after World War I, when the Bath Iron Works kind of fell on harder times, makes a bid to purchase the company, but he was not the high bidder, and he does not get to own the Bath Iron Works. But what he does do is he makes improvements after his wife dies to the mooring, and he creates what we now know as the Spanish Room that you can still see at the bed and breakfast. And then he surprises people. In 1927, he surprises people as being the largest stockholder of the Mack Truck Company. So he was a pretty smart businessman who acquired interest in various companies. And here we have a headline of Mack Trucks voter mystifies Wall Street. W.E. Reid of Portland, Maine, at an annual meeting with control of much of the stock, but the company was not concerned because they assume he's only an interested stockholder, and so things go on. But it was sort of, it certainly got people's attention. Who is this man from Maine? Well, his wife has passed away. He settles really permanently in Georgetown, and he becomes even selectman for the town of Georgetown in 1930. But what does he do? He immediately contests the town valuation of his property in Georgetown. Well, the town does not take that lightly. They file suit. They say, we need our money. And that goes all the way to 1936, when the Maine Supreme Court decides in favor of the town of Georgetown, and Walter Reid pays his past due taxes. And if he hadn't paid his taxes, the town of Georgetown again would have owned Reid State Park. But he paid his taxes, so he held on to it. In the meantime, what was happening in the state of Maine? We're in the late 1920s, 1930s, and it was economically a very difficult time. And the state began to realize that its natural resources could be a key part of its economy, that recreation, conservation was something to pay attention to. They created the Maine Development Commission to sort of investigate that and to promote Maine elsewhere as a place to do business. We see that Governor Baxter, gave his first gift of land that became Baxter State Park in the early 1930s. And the state issues then various reports. One deals with the natural beauty of Maine. Another one talks specifically about a survey of beaches, but this is in southern Maine between Kittery and Portland. But they also talk about a major park system, the need to create that mid-1930s. And it mentions specifically the potential for a park at Popham Beach. What else happens? Well, they create the Maine State Park Commission. This idea of vacation land, it for the first time appears on license plates in 1936. And a big report appears in 1939 that really specifically talks about the feasibility of acquiring property for the establishment of public bathing beaches. So the state had its eye on it. There was no public land that the state owned that included a beach property, but they were interested in. And again, it mentions Popham Beach as a potential. In World War II, a preliminary report for a Maine Park and Parkway recreational area study was issued. This was really a report that was then sent to the National Park Service, because the National Park Service was helping states to create state parks, because lots of states petitioned the federal government that their special property should be another national park. And the National Park Service says, no, we don't want that, but we'll help you create state parks. And that report again mentions Popham Beach, so it pops up again and again. Towards the end of World War II, a post-war planning report for the state of Maine comes up. It talks about all sorts of different aspects of the economy, including recreation. and it mentions Popham Beach and actually includes a concept sketch of what that could look like. However, in 1941, we come across a letter of then Governor Sumner Sewell to Walter Reid. Walter Reid is in his 70s by that time. And the letter says, "It was good to receive your letter and good to know that you are following our actions with interest. I think that the actions the governor was talking about are these reports that have been issued, that he was paying attention to that, Walter Reid. The governor also said, I always enjoyed talking things over." So Walter Reid had a connection with the governor's office, and in the early 1940s, I think the idea of a possible park was already being formulated. Another piece that I thought was interesting was in 1943. I'm sorry it's so faint, but it's a telegram that Walter Reid sends to the Attorney General's office of the state of Maine. And this particular telegram says, "We acknowledge the receipt of yours, but your suggestions will be carried out as speedily as possible, Walter Reid." So what were those suggestions? I think it was sort of getting your ducks in order, get your papers together, so that we can maybe do something here in 1943. We are in World War II. The Seguin Realty Company does one other thing. It issues a lease to the US Navy. And this lease talks about that it was for military purposes. It actually also comes with a description of what kind of improvements the Navy was allowed to make on this property and its various huts and targets. And in that time, the Navy used Reid State Park for target practice. They had a target floating in the sea. The dunes were the backstop, if you will. Planes came and would aim at the target and practice, if you will, for $1. The US Navy was allowed to use that property. And of course, we know what happened with that in the 1990s. Unexploded ordnance appeared after a storm, which all was from World War II. We also find a letter that the State Park Commission sends to the US Navy. And the State Parks Commission essentially says, we're interested in acquiring seashore property for public use. And with the cessation of hostilities, we wonder what you're going to do with what they then call the Little River beach property. And we would like to take a look at that area to look at its potential for a possible seashore state park. Well, what does the Navy write back? The Navy says, well, we don't quite know what to do with what we're going to do with this property, but for your information, the property is quite inaccessible, something that we already knew. But they say it's inaccessible and you need a weasel to get into the property, but we'll gladly help you with that. Well, here is a weasel, in case you wonder what that is. It's an amphibious vehicle that the United States government used much in World War II in various hard to traverse areas, snow, ice, water, what have you. So state officials traveled in a weasel to scope out the property. And we then have a letter that the state of Maine sends to Walter Reid. And it talks about, we'd like to send an engineer over. This is 1945, to make a survey, to make a rough sketch, to see where a road can be located. Can you please allow us to do that? Well, that visit did happen. And because we find actually a series of handwritten notes in the state archives. I think these notes were written by Charles Bradford, and Charles Bradford at that time was the superintendent of the Parks Commission, that he traveled with the highway engineer to Georgetown, met with Walter Reid, and Walter Reid, you sort of can imagine him standing at Griffith's Head. He says, yeah, this about this, and this is what you need to do here, and this is what I can do. And they made 5 pages of notes. These were important notes, so much so that the state of Maine typed them up, and they're in the archives. So I won't go through all of these notes, but it talks in part that yes, there was maybe a land donation coming, but Todd's point, 6 acres, definitely out. The camp at the head, out, half an acre. A 1 acre plot on Griffith's Head, reserved for commercial purposes. So Walter Reid was not donating all of the land. There were various pieces that were going to be not part of the agreement. We see at the bottom of this typewritten note, we see some handwritten comments from a state official. I still don't know who that was, but it's HBG. And HBG says, I don't like that deal. Would like to study it more. The Parks Commission should be careful not to get the state into a great something for the future, unless worthwhile. So they should be careful. So this, don't go too fast with this. So these exceptions to the gift of the 6 acres, the 1 acre, and the half acre at the hunting lodge, which is Camp Kilcare, still, that building still exists on the property, were really stumbling blocks in the creation of the park. The donation of land was going to be about 350 acres. We find evidence of that in a letter of November 1945 that the state sends to Walter Reid, and they say, well, the council, which was a advisory body to the governor, after due consideration, have reviewed the conditions attached, but the exclusive right to use the certain parcels for commercial purposes, make it impossible for the state to act favorably upon accepting the land. So it's not going to happen. But if you can see fit to revise your offer, we shall be pleased to consider it. So that's what they sent to Walter Reid. Well, probably more discussion happened. And then we find a letter of the new governor, Governor Hildreth, who writes to the park superintendent in March of 1946. And he says, you are aware that a valuable piece of seafront land may be given to the state in the near future. So things were in the offing. It was happening. And indeed, in March of 1946, the Seguinland Realty Company gets together. The children, Walter Reid is actually absent because he's in his late 70s and he's not in good health. But the official vote gets taken to donate the land to the state of Maine. A press release gets issued, written by the company, and it says this is a donation for a public park to be known as the Reid State Memorial Park in memory of John and Lydia Reid, the parents of Walter Reid. And what the press release also talks about is that they will give $1,500 to be used in the erection of a memorial gate. So, well, the newspaper was all over it. The Bath Independent picture, description of the property, the newspapers this was an earth-shattering event. The state of Maine given beaches for a huge public park. And it's sort of various articles you can find that deal with that. And here are the 3 children, Raymond, Everett, and Lillian, who are handing over the deed and the check to the governor. What else do we find in the record? Well, the record is a small article as a contrast to all these large articles, and it talks about Popham Beach. And what does the article talk about? Well, as we know, Popham Beach had appeared in all of those state reports, and the state had indeed attempted to buy land at Popham Beach. But securing property here in Popham was not too generally approved by too many people there. In fact, the land was too expensive. It was impossible to buy for the state at that time. and that many Popham people will be glad that the Park Beach development is not coming here. They said, Georgetown, you can have it. But many other people were very pleased, so much so that the Reid family sends a letter to the state of Maine just 2 months later. And the letter says, we, the Reid family, are so pleased with the responses that we're willing to give an additional gift of land. And they talk in this letter about giving an approximately 600 acres in addition to the 350 to the state of Maine. So a big happening, this promise of more land. Well, around that time, the governor and his council actually they all come to Georgetown. They meet in the Spanish room, as you can see in the bottom right. They sort of inspect the land, and they're very enthusiastic. The land initially was touted as a 600-acre gift plus another 600 acres, so there was 1,200 acres maybe in play. And the governor says it's utterly unspoiled, and that we need to use wisdom and caution to develop this property. But we hope that it can be done as soon as possible, because again, this land was inaccessible. It was there somewhere. And newspaper articles talk about that it may be 2 or 3 years before the state can really open this property to the public. But once it's open, the governor was told it could accommodate 10,000 people a day. So that's like a huge number of people. The Parks Commission writes again to Walter Reid. So this is about 6 months, 7 months after the donation of land. And they write to Walter Reid, and they're saying, a real stumbling block to securing funds, legislative funds, are the private property reserved at Todd's Point and Griffith's Head. And they kind of detail the objections that go with that. So they sort of say, we need money, but the fact that you have given us a sort of a Swiss cheese with holes in it because other people own these other properties, and you're holding back certain parcels of land, make it hard. And even the governor, in his inaugural address, Governor Hildreth, says that, well, we had this generous gift by Walter Reid, and we hope that detailed arrangements for the consummation of that gift can be speedily accomplished. But the legislature really needs to provide the funds necessary for the maximum development of the park. Anyway, so lots of improvements were needed. There's a list here. We needed a new Arousik to Woolwich Bridge. Route 127 needed to be improved. Seguinland Road really needed to be built because it didn't exist. A road needed to be built into the park. A dam or bridge needed to be built across what was known as the canal. Parking areas, bathhouses, water supplies, sanitary facilities, and ultimately a road to Todd's Point. So a whole list of things, all of which cost money. And the state really didn't have that money. So another huge stumbling block for the park. Big articles in the newspaper. This one talks about replacing the Arousik Bridge. And this particular author talks about that the time-defying Arousik Bridge was standing wearily but stubbornly in the path of progress. And that we really needed to have an accessible state park. I mean, this is a very juicy article. But I won't, in the interest of time, because I'm getting signals in the back, I need to move right along. So here is the Arousik Bridge, and this photo reportedly has Walter Reid crossing the bridge. This was a toll bridge. Walter Reid hated this bridge. I'm told by Gene Reynolds at this lectern in a prior presentation that Arousik residents could get across this bridge for free, but Georgetown residents had to pay toll. And Walter Reid didn't like that at all. Also, this bridge was in poor condition. And there is a story that actually I've come across where Walter Reed and his driver went over the bridge, and then just as they had gone over the bridge collapsed. And there is a photo in Gene Reynolds' book of a 1919 collapse of the bridge. So it might have been this particular collapse where Walter and his driver narrowly escaped drowning in the river. Anyway, so the state didn't appropriate money. Improvements were not being made. Walter Reed withdraws the promise of the second gift of land. Newspapers all over it, that is not happening, that he's not going to do this. He says, no, the deal is off. The newspapers write about that, and so the gray part in this map was the land that was donated. The black area was to be donated. One key person on the governor's council, Harold Hanold, deplores that happening. And so people start to point fingers as to who's to blame, the legislature, but also the governor is being pointed to, because the governor at one point gave a speech and said, these public parks really ought to be self-supporting, that the money the state would earn from people visiting should pay for operating the parks. So other people say we have other priorities. Letters get written to the editor that this was a terrible mistake. And even the Portland Press Herald starts to chime in with editorials. They talk about the official indifference of the state of Maine, and that the donors' gifts seem to be unappreciated by the state. Well, the state was not completely doing nothing. The state did hire the National Park Service, or hire is maybe a big word. The National Park Service offered assistance to the state in 1946, 1947, and sent various park planners to Maine to scope out various parks, including Reid State Park. So we have those reports, and they're quite detailed as to what is the possibility. But the state also gets a proposal from three engineers, landscape architects, one of whom was Myron Lamb. Myron Lamb was a landscape architect who came from Portland. One of the claims to fame is that he designed the Longfellow Garden behind the Maine Historical Society in Portland. And he worked for several years with the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm, the firm that was started by Frederick Law Olmsted. It was sort of the most well-known landscape architecture firm, did work all over the United States. So he was really part of that. And he was hired by the federal government to scope out sites for Bradbury Mountain, Lake St. George, Mount Blue, Sebago Lake State Park. So he was in the mid-1930s already doing that. World War II, he worked at the South Portland shipyard, and afterwards he opened his own office, Myron U. Lamb, landscape architect and site planning. Well, Myron wrote a letter and a three-page report that's quite detailed about the property to the Parks Commission, and says, this is beautiful, unspoiled portion of the Maine coast. It should be preserved in its native character. And if you do any development, it should recede in the background of the beach and the dune and the ledge and the forest. So you need to be careful in how you do this. But he also says the state has a moral obligation to Mr. Reid to do something concrete, and that there are very few spots on the Maine coast which are available to the public, and that every device should be thought of to start development. And so it's really saying to the state, come on, let's get on with it. And the state of Maine likes what he has to say and hires, Myron, to develop a design for the park. So newspaper reports on that. I have not been able to locate the official plan that Myron Lamb did for the park. The Maine State Library does have a very faint photocopy of a general plan for Reid State Park, Georgetown, Maine, that Myron Lamb did. And the newspaper shows a sketch of a bathhouse that could be built at the park. And so that's sort of what we know of the park. But we find a newspaper article that talks about the various state parks that were coming online in Maine in 1948, and it has a map that's actually of Reid State Park. And it shows various features that were built or not built. So to walk you through that real quick, the dam and footbridge were built, but a parking area and service road along Mile Beach, so a road along the beach, parking area sort of on the beach, were not built. A camping area at Haystack Point in the back was not developed, and the administrative area was not developed inside the park. So some things happened, other things just didn't happen. What did happen was that Walter Reid had acquired the schoolhouse that he went to as a young boy. I don't know when he acquired it, how that all happened, but he owns it, and he's willing to donate the schoolhouse to the state of Maine. And he says, if you pay for the upkeep, I'm willing to donate that. And the state says, well, we could make that into a museum. The other thing that Walter Reid did, was pushing the Maine voters through big advertisements in the newspaper to issue a $15 million bond issue. And you see here on the right, no axe to ground, but yours was the text of the advertisement. And it talks about the menace of unsafe bridges that should be eliminated. Remember that bridge? He also talks about that we need to have properly developed recreational facilities. Wonder which ones. So he was sort of pushing that. And lo and behold, pressure mounts on the legislature. We have now a near tragedy on our hands. The legislature is told $325,000 are being requested from the legislature, half of which is from Reid State Park, and lo and behold, that gets approved. So finally, money is forthcoming, and work starts on the road. All sorts of articles talk about that. They start work on the bridge, and here we have the bridge being built. We have the old bridge on the right with sardine cutters going through it. The park dam and bridge gets built, the original bridge that was replaced last year with a new bridge. And Seguinland Road gets built. You see here the man with the jackhammer on the right, creating a way to get to the park. Walter Reid is well aware that all this work is happening, and he in August says, all right, I'm willing to renew my offer of the gift of land to the state. I see that you're making good progress. And what I wanted from the state, I wanted to have some assurance that they would have a development as well as a gift of land. That's why he was holding out to the state. And he writes a very interesting letter. He's 80 years old. We have a 2.5-page letter to the Parks Commission. And he says, I got your letter that you sent to me. We're in 1949, so we're 3.5 years after the donation of the land in the first place. And he says, there are some matters that are troubling you. And that I have had some very unpleasant experience with the Parks Commission. There really was little or no Parks Commission that functions at that time. And he says, gives a little history. He says, the US Navy came to me and wanted to buy the land, but I told them it was not for sale. And then there was a man by the name of Sewell Webster, who was the city clerk of the city of Augusta and was a developer of Indian Point in Georgetown, and was a friend of Walter Reid. He also wanted to buy the land, but at that time I just decided to offer it to the state of Maine as a park, so I told him it was not for sale. Then Sewell Webster said, can I talk to the governor about your property? And I said, yeah, you can do that. And the governor came down And he was very much enthused about what they had seen. So he sort of says that kind of put things in motion. But after he made that offer of land, nothing more was heard from the state for 13 months. So more than a year, the state just didn't do anything. So I withdrew my offer. But then the new governor said to me, Governor Payne, he said, please don't do anything to disturb the situation until I can do something. And I said, okay, I will do that. And then all this work happened and I renewed my offer. But I do want my personal hunting lodge to stay in my own possession because that's the place where I find rest when I badly need it. And he said, members of the Parks Commission tried my patience. And he says, but you have made a lot of progress. I'm sorry, I cannot say the same about the Parks Commission. He says, I'm now past 80 years of age. I'm not in good health. And please pardon me if I become impatient. So, very sort of telling letter of the dynamics between Walter Reid and the state of Maine. State of Maine wonders what to say back. There are various drafts of letters that are crossed out, as you can see, sort of annotated. No, we can't say that. No, we can't say this. But they say, well, we cannot approve under any circumstances the so-called leases for the operation of concessions within the park, those commercial uses. Sewell Webster was going to run the concession stand, and the state says, no, we cannot do that. But for sentimental reasons, we think we can accept your 1.5 acres for your hunting lodge. That the governor, we can probably talk the governor into that. So we're trying to strike a compromise. Anyway, a representative of Walter Reid writes to the Parks Commission and says, well, Mr. Reid is not very well, has just returned from the hospital, and he cannot receive you, but he hopes to meet with you in the future to talk things over. So to try to work out some sort of compromise. But he was ill. He was 80 plus years old. The Parks Commission writes back to Walter Reid in 1950 and says, we want to clear up some confusion or misunderstanding. And the retention of that retreat, that hunting lodge by you, we're now somewhat disturbed because we find that this land has been leased to Mr. Webster and that it was going to be concession. So they had moved from Todd's Point to the hunting lodge, and the state says, no, that's really a problem. Well, as I mentioned, the work had happened to create all those improvements, and the park was about to open its doors in 1950. So now we're 4 years past the donation of land to the state when the park officially opens. And this donation of extra land does become a reality in August of 1950. Various articles talk about that. And we find an interesting note in the State of Maine files between the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General. And it says, about the Parks Commission struggle with Reid. So they have the other perspective. Reid struggled with the Parks Commission, while the Parks Commission struggled with Reid. And that, well, yeah, maybe we could have a ceremony, but you really just need the deed. Well, the ceremony did happen. The governor did come to Georgetown. There he is with Walter Reid in the middle, handing over the deed of the property to the governor and various other notables. Walter Reid seizes this opportunity to make one last speech. There's a 4-page speech. He has a state official read the speech because he cannot do that himself. He's 81 years old. He essentially in this speech talks about the history of Georgetown. He says, you don't know much about Georgetown, but this happened, that happened, what have you. So it's a very tempered speech. He's not, he's not chewing people out. And he says, I hope that this property will bring you health and happiness. It's a natural sanctuary. Guard it well. It will be the source of all you anticipate. It is historical and unspoiled. Its beauties cannot be exaggerated. So he's really sort of saying you have something quite wonderful here. And the state and all of us, indeed, we have it. But it was not just 2 donations of land or transactions of land. We have here the map that the state has along with the property sheet, and it shows no less than 14 different transactions that happened that comprise the 779 acres that the park is currently. So it was a much more complicated happening. So you thought, well, maybe this is now all settled, the state has all this land. Well, we have a telegram from Walter Reid to the Parks Commission. And the Walter Reid, he has an issue with a necessary alteration at the canal, and he's wondering if you, and this is the Parks Commission, or your associates are bigger than the state of Maine. Walter E. Reid. Well, the Parks Commission writes back and tries to soften things. It's very unfortunate that we had a misunderstanding. We're deeply appreciative of your generosity. But it would be a serious mistake to permit the having a privately owned concession within the boundaries of the park. So they're holding firm that, thank you very much, but no, we can't do that. Well, so let's go back to the bridge, the Aroustic Bridge. Here's a picture of it. And what happens with the Aroustic Bridge, because the new bridge was built, this is probably a picture taken from the new bridge to where the old bridge was located. Walter Reid buys the old bridge. What he will do with the structure is not known. The newspaper writes, and this is 1951, maybe he's going to cut it up with an axe because it has been such a thorn in his side. And Todd Barabee tells me that Walter Reid bought that bridge for $10. And he still has signs that were hanging at that old bridge in his possession. And finally, the state of Maine gets around to spending the $1,500 to build the memorial gate. And there are 2 plaques on either side of the gate that actually talk about this as being a gift to John and Lydia Reid in memory of Walter Reid's parents. Lots of people come to the park, 2,500 people in 1952, a record flow, and other things happen. Various garden clubs get together, and Harriet Worrell, who was a summer resident in Georgetown and came from Philadelphia, worked with notables like Billy Todd and Josephine Newman to lay out a nature trail at the park. And here you see the ladies with the park superintendent traversing the property. And other officials come to the park because they realize that the attraction of the park really required them to do more development, and they're scoping out Todd's Point. So where you see the sea with that parking area, that's the Todd's Point parking lot, and the road that sort of goes through the marsh to access that. They were sort of scoping that out. A second nature trail is being dedicated at the park, and this one is in memory of Clara Holway. And here we have Walter Reid with the painting of his wife at the ceremony, and the same women that were involved before were involved again. Walter Reid is 84. A representative of Walter Reid, when he's 85, writes to the Parks Commission, when the Parks Commission wrote to the son of Walter, Everett, that they were writing because the state at that point wanted to build the park superintendent's office and sort of maintenance area. Where can we do that? Here. Well, Walter Reid is right now at the Maine General Hospital, and his son I cannot even, it's impossible at this time to talk with him about that. But of course, we hope for improvement. It was not to be. On May 29th, 1955, Walter Reid passes away. The New York Times has an obituary of him in the newspaper. Local newspapers, of course, has an obituary. There's a lovely article by Agnes Powers with a really fun anecdote about Walter Reid that appears later in June in the Bath Independent. He's not buried in Georgetown. He's buried in Waterville, in Pine Grove Cemetery. And here we have a picture of Pine Grove Cemetery, and I found his plot, and there is the stone where he's buried, along with his wife and along with his 3 children. He turned 86 years old. So at the 100th anniversary of his birth, Down East Magazine devoted a whole big article to him. And the same author who wrote the article in 1946 was recruited to write this article. And he writes, among other things, that visitors have come in 1969 from 50 states and 13 foreign countries. And then it talks more about the life of Walter Reid. And interestingly, in 1969 was the year that Popham Beach State Park was created for the first time. So 26 years after Reid State Park, Popham Beach did become a reality. So full circle. What about this full circle? He was born in Harmon's Harbor. He went to a school that was just 1 mile away. He built his big hotel just 1/10 of a mile away. He lived the last 30 some years of his life a quarter of a mile of his birthplace. And what I think is his greatest achievement, Reid State Park, was just 1.5 miles up the road from his birthplace. So I find that sort of a remarkable thing for a man who could have lived anywhere, but he chose to stay right here in Georgetown, Maine. Thank you very much.